Silas Boone's hand closed around the jar before Vivian could move. Not one jar. All of them. He walked the length of the work table with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had made up his mind long before he walked through that door, and he upended every single container of Vivian's curing mixture into the mud outside the smokehouse, while 40 ranch hands watched and said nothing. 3 weeks of work. Every ratio she had calibrated by hand, every salt measurement adjusted for altitude, every formula she had rebuilt from scratch after studying the smokehouse's original draft logs, gone in under 2 minutes, soaking into the Montana dirt like it had never existed at all. "No woman runs anything on this ranch," Silas said, and he said it loudly enough that the words carried all the way to where Cole Ashford stood at the far edge of the yard. Cole didn't move. Vivian looked at him across that distance, and he looked back, and then he looked away. If you've ever had something you built with your own hands destroyed in front of people who were supposed to protect it, and had to decide in that moment whether to collapse or keep standing, then you already know what Vivian Hale felt in the next 10 seconds. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She picked up the empty jars one by one, set them back on the table, and walked back inside the smokehouse. That night, she didn't sleep. She rebuilt every formula from memory before sunrise. This is the story of what happened next. And trust me, you're going to want to stay until the very end, because what Vivian does with a forgotten smokehouse and a powerful man's doubt is going to stay with you long after the final scene. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next on this channel. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The road into Ashford Ranch didn't announce itself. There was no gate, no sign, no grand entrance designed to remind visitors where they stood in the order of things. There was only a long dirt track cutting through a valley so wide and so still that the mountains on both sides felt less like scenery and more like walls. Like the land itself had drawn a border around everything Cole Ashford owned and dared the rest of the world to cross it. Vivian Hale crossed it on a Tuesday morning in early October, sitting upright in the back of a supply wagon with her traveling bag wedged between her feet and her eyes taking in everything the driver had long since stopped bothering to look at. She wasn't the kind of woman who traveled with much. One bag, worn at the corners, a journal she'd kept since she was 17, a small tin box that held the only things she'd never once considered leaving behind, a handful of handwritten notes from a smokehouse operation she'd studied in Tennessee 3 years before the man who built it died and his sons burned everything to the ground, rather than let an outsider learn from it. She'd salvaged those notes from a trash pile in the rain. That detail mattered, though not because it was dramatic. It mattered because it was the most accurate summary of how Vivian Hale had spent the last 9 years, moving from one operation to another across the American West and South, learning everything she could from people who mostly didn't want to teach her, salvaging whatever knowledge she could carry when those operations ended or closed or simply turned her away. She was 31 years old, and she had never once been given anything without having to fight for the right to use it. The wagon stopped at the edge of the main yard, and Vivian climbed down without waiting for help. The driver had been polite enough, a quiet older man named Estes, who handled the ranch's supply runs and clearly had opinions he'd decided not to share. He pointed her toward the main house, a long, low-slung structure built for function rather than impression, and drove the wagon toward the barn without another word. Vivian stood in the yard for a moment. She saw the cattle in the distance, moving along a ridge line in a slow brown wave. She saw the bunkhouse, the feed barn, the water troughs, the organized industry of a ranch that had been running at serious scale for long enough that the efficiency was baked into the ground itself. Every fence post stood straight. Every building looked maintained. There was money here, obvious and unashamed, the kind that doesn't feel the need to perform because it's been in place long enough to simply be the landscape. None of that was what made her stop. At the far edge of the property, half hidden by a stand of bare cottonwood trees and set back from everything else like something that had been deliberately put out of sight, sat a building she almost missed. Low roof, stone chimney that had clearly cracked along one side and been left unrepaired. The door was shut, but not padlocked. The whole structure had the particular quality of something that had been given up on rather than finished. Not broken exactly, but abandoned in the middle of a thought. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the main house, because she knew without being told that the abandoned building was the only reason she was here. Cole Ashford was standing at the window when she knocked. He opened the door himself. She would learn that he almost always did, a habit his housekeeper Martha found quietly maddening. And he looked at her for a fraction of a second longer than was polite before he stepped back to let her in. He was not what she expected, though she'd long since stopped expecting the men she worked for to match their reputations. Cole Ashford, at 44, was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something more interesting than it had probably started out as. He moved carefully, the way people do when they've learned that moving too fast in certain situations costs something. His handshake was brief and firm, and he didn't smile when he did it. "Miss Hale," he said, "you're earlier than I thought." "The supply wagon runs on a fixed schedule," she said. "I didn't have any reason to delay it." He studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not skepticism exactly, but a kind of controlled assessment, like a man doing arithmetic in his head that he didn't want to show on his face. Then he gestured toward the table and they both sat down. What followed was not really an interview so much as a negotiation. Neither of them had formally agreed to enter. Cole laid out what he wanted plainly: a smokehouse operation producing premium cured meats at a quality level that could compete with the best operations in the territory, built on the existing structure at the edge of his property, operational within 6 months if possible. He had hired 3 men before her, he said. 2 had quit inside a month. 1 had stayed 4 months before producing a single batch of product so inconsistent that Cole had quietly disposed of it and sent the man home. Vivian listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Can I see the building first?" Cole looked at her. "You haven't accepted the job yet." "I know," she said. "I need to see the building before I decide whether the job is worth accepting." There was a silence that lasted just long enough to be interesting. Then Cole stood up, took a key from the hook by the door, and walked with her across the yard. The inside of the smokehouse was worse than the outside had suggested, and better than she'd feared. The main chamber was still structurally sound, the stone walls thick enough that the temperature would hold once she got the chimney repaired. The racks had been left in place and were salvageable with work. The ventilation system, such as it had been, was wrong for serious production, but wrong in ways she understood and knew how to fix. Someone had built this operation with knowledge, but without enough patience to finish thinking it through, and the evidence of that specific failure was visible in a dozen small details that someone without her experience would have missed entirely. She walked the space twice without speaking. Cole stood near the door and watched her. On her second pass, she crouched down near the chimney base, ran her hand along the cracked stone, and said, without looking up, "Who built the original draw system?" "Ranch hand named Paulson," Cole said. "Left 3 years ago." "Self-taught?" "Far as I know." "That explains the chimney placement," she said. "It's off by about 14 inches. That's why every batch you've ever tried to run in here has had uneven heat distribution. The men you hired weren't failing because they didn't know what they were doing. They were failing because the building was working against them, and none of them knew enough to understand why." Cole was quiet for a moment. "And you do?" "Yes," she said simply. She stood up, brushed the stone dust from her palm, and looked at him directly. "I'll take the job, but I need one condition." "What condition?" "Complete authority over this building and every decision made inside it. Materials, process, scheduling, staffing, assignment to this operation. All of it goes through me. I don't report to the foreman. I report to you directly, and only you." The silence this time was longer. She knew what she was asking, and she knew what it cost a man in Cole Ashford's position to agree to it. She was not a known quantity in Montana. She was young. She was a woman. And she was standing in his smokehouse telling him that his foreman, a man who had helped build this ranch from a much smaller operation and who commanded the respect of every working hand on the property, would have no authority over her or her work. She watched him weigh it. "Silas Boone has run the operations side of this ranch for 11 years, Cole said. "I understand that," Vivian said, "and I'm not here to interfere with anything he manages. I'm here to fix your smokehouse. Those are 2 completely separate things, and they need to stay that way if you want this to work." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the cracked chimney at the misaligned racks, at the ventilation holes cut in the wrong positions. He looked at the tin box she was holding, which she hadn't explained and he hadn't asked about. "All right," he said. "You have the condition." He didn't offer his hand this time. He simply turned and walked back across the yard, and Vivian stood alone in the abandoned building with the key in her palm and a very clear sense that she had just agreed to something that was going to be considerably more complicated than fixing a chimney. She was right. Silas Boone found out about the arrangement before dinner that evening. Vivian knew this because she could hear the conversation through the thin wall of the room Martha had shown her to, and because Silas was not a man who kept his feelings quiet when he felt they were being ignored. "She's a stranger," he said. "She walked onto this property this morning, Cole. This morning. And you gave her authority over every decision on that smokehouse." "I gave her what she needed to do the job," Cole said. "Every man on this crew is going to see that as a judgment against them, against me. This isn't about you, Silas. Everything on this ranch is about whether the men who built it are still trusted to run it," Silas said, and his voice carried the particular quality of a man who is saying something he believes is simply, plainly true, and cannot understand why the person he's saying it to can't see it. "You bring in an outsider, a woman, Cole, a woman none of these men have ever seen work, and you tell them she has more authority than the man who's kept this operation running for 11 years. What do you think that says to them?" There was a pause that Vivian couldn't read. "It says, I want the smokehouse to work," Cole said finally. "Sleep on it, Silas." She heard the sound of a door closing, and then silence. Vivian sat on the edge of her bed in the small room and stared at the key in her hand. She had been in variations of this situation before. Not exactly this, never a ranch this size, never stakes quite this high. But the essential shape of it was familiar, a job she was qualified to do, surrounded by people who had decided before she started that she wasn't qualified to do it, with one man in the middle who had given her an opportunity he was only halfway committed to protecting. The question was never whether that resistance would come. The question was always what form it would take and how long it would take to arrive. She put the key in the tin box with the Tennessee notes, lay down on the bed with her boots still on, and was asleep in 4 minutes. She started work at 5:30 the next morning. The first week was inventory and assessment. She went through every inch of the smokehouse with a methodical attention that she had learned over years of working in conditions where no one else was paying careful attention was the only defense against making expensive mistakes. She cataloged every structural problem in her journal. She mapped the heat flow from the existing chimney design and confirmed what she'd suspected from the beginning. The draw was wrong in 3 separate places, and any serious production run attempted with the current setup would produce exactly the kind of uneven results Cole's previous hires had delivered. She wrote up a materials list and presented it to Cole on the 4th morning. He looked at it carefully, asked 3 questions, approved it, and sent the order to town. What he didn't tell her, what she found out from Estes, the supply wagon driver, who had apparently decided she was worth talking to after all, was that 2 of his previous hires had submitted materials lists that Cole had approved and that had subsequently produced nothing useful. I was approving her list. In other words, not because he fully believed in it, but because he had committed to giving her the same chance he'd given the others, and he was a man who kept his commitments even when he'd started to doubt them. Vivian filed that information away. She was deep in the chimney reconstruction when Silas appeared for the first time. He didn't speak to her directly. He stood at the open door of the smokehouse with 2 of his senior hands, men named Garrett and Pruitt, both of whom had been on the ranch for years, and he watched her work in a way that was designed to communicate something without saying it out loud. She kept working. After a while, Silas said to Garrett, just loud enough to carry, "Waste of good stone." Garrett made a non-committal sound. Vivian set down her measuring line, turned around, and looked at Silas. "You need something from this building?" Silas met her eyes. He had a broad, sun-damaged face and the kind of stillness that can read as patience or as contempt, depending on what's behind it. "Just looking," he said. "Then you can look from somewhere else," she said. "I'm working." There was a long pause. Silas looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the floor. Silas turned and walked away without another word, and Garrett and Pruitt followed him. Vivian turned back to the chimney. Her hands were steady. That was the thing she had trained herself on over years of working in rooms where people were waiting for her to make a mistake. She had learned to keep her hands steady and let her face show nothing and save whatever she actually felt for later, when she was alone and the work was done and it was safe to feel it. She worked until it was too dark to see, went back to her room, wrote 2 pages in her journal, and slept. The chimney reconstruction took 11 days. She worked systematically, repointing the cracked stone, adjusting the height and the draw angle with measurements she had taken from 3 different smokehouse designs over her years of study and then adapted for the specific conditions of this altitude and this building. When she was done, she built a small test fire and stood in the building for 4 hours watching the smoke move. It moved the way she needed it to move. She allowed herself a single satisfied breath and went on to the next problem. The ventilation system was harder. The existing holes had been cut in positions that made intuitive sense. If you'd learned smokehouse principles from books, but hadn't spent enough time watching what smoke actually did in a sealed space. She spent 3 days designing a modified system, wrote out her reasoning in detail in her journal, and then started the work. It was during the ventilation work that she got her first unexpected ally. His name was Tommy Wick, and he was 19 years old and had been assigned to general labor around the ranch yard, which mostly meant doing whatever jobs the senior hands didn't want to do. He appeared at the smokehouse door on a Wednesday afternoon and said, without preamble, "Silas said I'm supposed to haul your waste stone to the dump pile." "All right," Vivian said. He came in, started loading the waste stone into a wheelbarrow, and then stopped. He was looking at the modified ventilation design she had sketched on a piece of paper and pinned to the wall. "What's that?" he said. "That's the ventilation plan for this building," she said. He looked at it for another moment. "How come there are holes on 2 different levels? Other buildings only have them at the top." It was a genuine question. She could tell the difference. She'd been asked enough fake questions in her life, the kind designed to expose rather than learn. This one was just curiosity, the kind that didn't know yet whether it would get an answer. "Because heat doesn't move in a straight line," she said. "It pools. If you only vent at the top, you get hot pockets near the ceiling and cool spots lower down, and the meat cures unevenly. The lower vents redirect the heat flow so the temperature stays consistent through the whole chamber." Tommy looked at the diagram again, then at the current holes in the wall, then back at the diagram. "Oh," he said, in the particular tone of someone who has just understood something they didn't know they wanted to understand. "That makes sense." He hauled the waste stone out and came back 3 more times before the day was done. On his last trip, when Vivian was marking the positions for the new vent cuts, he said, "You want help holding the level?" "Yes," she said. "Hold it there." He held it steady without being asked twice, and he didn't talk while she was measuring, and those 2 things put him ahead of a significant portion of the experienced adults she'd worked with over the years. The curing mixture development was the work she cared about most, though she was careful not to show it. The smokehouse's physical structure was a problem with known solutions. Difficult, time-consuming, requiring precision and patience, but fundamentally mechanical. The curing formulas were something else. They were the part of the work that couldn't be looked up or borrowed from someone else's notes, the part that had to be built from experiment and adjustment and careful record-keeping across dozens of batches, the part where 9 years of experience and observation either paid off or didn't. She started with a base formula she'd developed and refined over 2 years in a small operation in Wyoming, then began adjusting it for the specific characteristics of the Ashford Ranch beef, the altitude, the fat content, the particular way the cattle were fed and finished. Every ratio went into her journal in precise detail. Every adjustment was logged with the date and her reasoning. The small containers she used to organize each variation were labeled in her careful handwriting, each one sitting in its specific position on the work table, a record of weeks of careful thought made physical and visible. She was proud of them in the way she was proud of any work done carefully. Not boastfully proud. She knew they were still at an early stage, still being refined, still 6 to 8 iterations from the consistency she needed, but proud in the private, quiet way that comes from knowing you've done something right. She should have locked the building when she went to dinner. She knew that afterward, sitting alone in the dark going over the sequence of events in her mind. She should have locked it. She hadn't, because she'd never once felt the need to lock a building to protect her work from deliberate destruction, and that particular failure of imagination cost her 3 weeks of development in under 2 minutes. The morning Silas came in was clear and cold. Vivian had arrived at the smokehouse early, as she always did, and was in the process of reviewing the previous day's notes when she heard the yard outside go quiet. In the particular way yards go quiet when something is about to happen that everyone already knows about except the person it's about to happen to. She turned from the table just as Silas walked through the door. He had Garrett with him, and Pruitt, and 4 other hands she recognized from the yard. Behind them, further back, she could see a dozen more men who had found reasons to be near the smokehouse that morning. Silas didn't say anything at first. He walked to the work table and stood looking at it, at the rows of labeled containers, at the journal open to her most recent formula notes, at the evidence of weeks of patient, systematic work. Then he picked up the first jar. "Silas," Vivian said. He carried it outside and dumped it in the mud. He came back for the second. She stood very still. She was calculating. Not her anger, which was there, which was considerable, but whether physical intervention would make this worse or stop it, whether anything would stop it, whether Cole was watching and whether his watching would matter, whether there was anything in the next 90 seconds she could actually affect. She looked across the yard and found Cole standing at the far edge, and Cole found her looking at him, and he didn't move. Silas made 4 more trips. He was methodical about it, which was somehow the worst part. Not frenzied or emotional, just deliberate and thorough, the way a man behaves when he's absolutely certain he has the right. When the last container was empty, he set it back on the table with a small, precise sound, and he said, "No woman runs anything on this ranch," and he walked out. The yard was very quiet. Vivian stood at the empty table for a moment. Then she looked at Tommy Wick, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd at some point, and was now standing a few feet from the door with an expression on his face that was equal parts horrified and helpless. "Tommy," she said, "can you bring me a clean bucket of water and a rag?" He was gone and back in less than 3 minutes. She cleaned the empty jars. Then she sat down at the table with her journal, opened it to the first formula entry, and started writing. She had a choice to make, and she made it quickly, in the same way she made most of the practical decisions in her life, by looking at what the situation actually required and deciding whether she was willing to pay the cost. She could walk to Cole's house right now and demand a response. She had the right to do it. What Silas had done was deliberate destruction of work materials under her authority, and Cole had given her his word that the smokehouse was hers to manage. She could stand in front of him and say plainly that the condition she'd been given had been violated in front of 40 witnesses, and she required him to address it. And Cole might address it, he might reprimand Silas or do something that looked like reprimanding Silas, and the crew would see it, and Silas would feel it, and none of it would change the fundamental fact that she had been here 3 weeks, and already the men who worked this ranch had decided she was someone to be removed by force. Addressing it through Cole would make her dependent on Cole's willingness to protect her. She was not going to be dependent on anyone's willingness to protect her. She kept writing. By midnight, she had reconstructed 11 of the 14 primary formulas from memory. Her memory was good. She had trained it deliberately, over years of working in places where she couldn't trust her materials not to be lost or taken. But good memory is not perfect memory, and she knew there were refinements in the original batches that she wouldn't be able to reproduce exactly. She would have to rerun some of the earlier experiments. It would cost time. She kept writing. At 2 a.m, Tommy knocked softly on the smokehouse door and came in without waiting, which told her he'd been watching for her light. He set a plate of cold biscuits and a cup of coffee on the table beside her journal and said nothing. She looked at the food, then at him. "You're going to make yourself sick," he said. "That's what my mother used to tell me when I stayed up to spite someone." "I'm not staying up to spite someone," she said. "I'm working." "Yeah," he said. He looked at her journal, at the pages of formula notes she'd been reconstructing. "Do you need me to check the labels? I remember what most of them said. I read them a few times when I was hauling stone." She stared at him. "I have a good memory for things that are written down," he said, in a slightly defensive tone. "It's not useful very often." It turned out to be useful that night. Tommy sat across from her for 2 hours, and what he remembered wasn't the numbers. He didn't have the background to remember or understand the numbers, but he remembered the labels, the names she'd given each variation, the sequence they'd been arranged in on the table, and from that information she was able to reconstruct the organization of the developmental series more accurately than she could have from memory alone. By 4 a.m, every formula was on paper. By sunrise, the replacement batches were started. She walked to breakfast with wood smoke in her hair and a 4-page entry in her journal and the steady, tired satisfaction of someone who had refused to let a bad night define the morning. The crew noticed. Not all of them, and not immediately. But she started seeing small things shift over the following days. A hand who would previously have walked past without acknowledgement now gave her a nod. Someone left a fresh box of salt on the smokehouse step without comment. Tommy, who had never been given latitude to choose his own work, started spending more of his time at the smokehouse without anyone apparently objecting. Garrett, Silas's second, watched all of this from a careful distance. He came into the smokehouse alone one afternoon, when Tommy was the only other person there, and he stood looking at the rebuilt chimney for a long time. "She fixed that herself?" he said to Tommy. "Mostly," Tommy said. "I held things when she needed 2 people." Garrett looked at the ventilation holes, now cut at the correct levels and properly finished. He looked at the rebuilt rack system, which Vivian had redesigned for better air circulation. He looked at the work table, now organized according to her system, with a new set of labeled containers in their precise positions. He left without speaking to her. But 2 days later, when she needed help moving a section of rebuilt rack framing that was too heavy for 2 people, Garrett appeared with Pruitt, and they moved it without being asked and without saying anything about why they'd come. She thanked them directly. She didn't make it into something it wasn't. What she understood from years of navigating exactly this kind of terrain was that the resistance of men like Garrett and Pruitt was not permanent. It was structural, built into the situation by the fact of her arrival and what it implied about their judgment and their sufficiency. But it wasn't personal, and it wasn't unassailable. What shifted it was not performance or argument or demonstrations of exceptional ability designed to shame them into admiration. What shifted it was simple consistency. Showing up every day, doing the work correctly, treating the men who helped her with straightforward respect, and the men who obstructed her with the same flat, unremarkable acknowledgement that their obstruction hadn't moved her. The work was the argument. She didn't need to make any other kind. Victor Blackwell arrived at the end of Vivian's 4th week. She heard the name before she saw the man. Estes mentioned it while unloading supplies, in the careful, neutral tone he used when he wanted to convey something without technically saying it. "Blackwell's in with Cole," he said, stacking crates near the smokehouse door. "Been in there about an hour." Vivian continued what she was doing, which was reviewing temperature logs from the test fires she'd been running in the rebuilt chimney. "Who's Blackwell?" she said. "Victor Blackwell. Owns the Blackwell operation up the valley. Second biggest ranch in this part of Montana." Estes paused. "He and Cole have an understanding about markets, particular about who operates what in this territory." Vivian wrote a number in her log. "What kind of understanding?" Estes picked up his empty crates. "The kind that works fine as long as nobody does anything that changes the balance," he said, and went back to the wagon. She thought about that through the afternoon. Blackwell came to see the smokehouse himself before he left. He came alone, which she suspected was deliberate, and he stood in the doorway in a way that communicated he was not going to come further in. He was perhaps 50, polished in the careful way of a man who had made money and then spent some of it on making sure it didn't show too much. Good coat, good boots, the ease of someone who had spent decades in rooms where he was the most important person present. He looked at the rebuilt chimney, the new venting system, the organized work table. "Nice work," he said, in a tone that made it sound like an observation about something inconsequential. "You've been busy." "Yes," Vivian said. "Cole putting a lot of faith in this operation." "He is," she said. Blackwell looked at her directly for the first time. "You aware of what this ranch has tried and failed to do with that building 3 times in 6 years?" "4 times," she said, "counting the original attempt." He smiled slightly. 4 times, he agreed. "Cole's a persistent man. Got to admire that." He looked around the building once more. "Hope it works out for him," he said, and left. She stood at the work table after he'd gone, listening to the sound of his horse leaving the yard. Whatever Victor Blackwell was, he was not a man wishing Cole Ashford success. She had spent enough years reading rooms and reading people to know the difference between a courtesy visit and a reconnaissance, and she knew which one she'd just been part of. She picked up her pen and went back to her temperature log. She had work to do. And whatever Blackwell was planning, she intended to be far enough along in the smokehouse's development by the time he acted that his interference would require considerably more than a visit to accomplish anything worth his while. Outside, the Montana sky was going dark above the mountains, and the first real cold of the season was settling into the valley and in the rebuilt smokehouse at the edge of Ashford Ranch. A single lamp burned through the night, while Vivian Hale wrote in her journal and refused, as she had refused every night of her adult life, to let anyone else's doubt determine what she was capable of becoming. She had a smokehouse to build, and she was just getting started. The cold settled deeper into the valley through the first week of November, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically, but simply arrived and stayed, working its way into everything that wasn't properly sealed against it. Vivian noticed it in the smokehouse first. The rebuilt chimney performed exactly as her calculations had predicted. The draw was clean, the heat distribution even, the temperature climbing and holding within the range she needed. But the cold outside meant she had to adjust her timing on the curing process, accounting for the lower ambient temperature and what it did to the early stages of the salt penetration. She made the adjustments, logged them, and kept working. The ranch had settled into a pattern around her, which was not the same thing as the ranch accepting her. Silas Boone went about his work with the deliberate, contained quality of a man who had made a decision about something and was waiting for events to prove him right. He didn't interfere with her again directly, not after the morning with the jars, not with any further physical action, but he didn't need to. He had the kind of authority that operated quietly, through suggestion and example, and the thousand small signals that a man in his position could send without ever saying a word that anyone could point to. He assigned Tommy Wick to fence repair the morning after Tommy spent 4 hours helping Vivian reconstruct formula notes. The assignment wasn't unusual. Fence repair was legitimate work, it needed doing, but the timing was exact enough that Vivian didn't miss it, and neither did Tommy, judging by the expression on his face when he told her. "I'll be back when he's got someone else on it," Tommy said. "Don't make trouble over it," she said. "I'm not making trouble," he said, with the slightly insulted tone of a 19-year-old who had not yet learned to distinguish between making trouble and refusing to be moved. "I'm just telling you." She put him to work for the hour before his reassignment took effect, and she filed the pattern away without comment. It happened again with a hand named Deke, who had started appearing near the smokehouse in the mornings, not because he'd been assigned there, but because he had a genuine curiosity about the curing process and wasn't skilled enough at concealing it. He asked Vivian one afternoon how she knew when the salt had fully penetrated a cut of meat, and she spent 20 minutes explaining it, the visual markers, the compression test, the way the color changed at the muscle fiber level. And he listened with the absorbed attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than just appear knowledgeable. 3 days later, he was reassigned to the far pasture for the better part of a week. Vivian noted it. She didn't mention it to Cole because mentioning it to Cole meant asking Cole to fight a battle she hadn't asked him to fight, and she was not in the habit of outsourcing her problems to men who'd already demonstrated they were uncertain about their commitment to her. What she did instead was keep working, and keep the smokehouse door open during daylight hours, and treat every man who came within conversation distance of the building as someone who might be persuaded by results, even if he couldn't be persuaded by argument. The first serious test batch went into the smokehouse on a Monday in the second week of November. She had spent 6 weeks getting to this point, the chimney rebuilt, the ventilation corrected, the racks refinished and repositioned, the curing formulas developed through a series of small test runs that had told her what she needed to know about how this particular building behaved at production temperature. The batch she put in on Monday was not large by the standards she intended to eventually reach, but it was real production, a dozen cuts of premium beef, each one prepped and cured according to her formula, each one hung at a precise position on the racks to account for the heat distribution she had mapped through weeks of test fires. She checked it every 4 hours through the first day, every 2 hours through the second. She slept in the smokehouse the second night, wrapped in a blanket in the corner with her journal in her lap, waking at intervals to check the temperature and make adjustments. Tommy found her there in the morning. "You slept here," he said. "Some," she said. He looked at the meat on the racks, which was developing the deep, even color that told her the process was running correctly. "Looks good," he said, with the careful tone of someone who isn't sure whether his opinion is welcome. "It does," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Silas told Garrett you'd probably ruin the first batch and try to blame the building." Vivian poured herself a cup of cold coffee from the tin she'd left on the work table the previous afternoon. What did Garrett say? Nothing. He just nodded. Tommy paused. But he came by twice last night. I saw him from the bunkhouse window. He didn't go in, just looked at the light. She drank her cold coffee and didn't respond to that because there wasn't anything useful to say about it. Garrett looking at her light in the middle of the night could mean a dozen different things, and she had learned, over years of operating in close quarters with men who had complicated feelings about her presence, that speculating about their internal states was a reliable way to get things wrong. What she knew was what the meat on the racks was telling her. And what it was telling her on the morning of the third day was that the process was working. The batch came out on Thursday. She pulled the first cut herself, early in the morning before the yard was fully awake, and she sliced it with the same knife she'd been using for 9 years. A good knife, well-maintained, one of the few things she'd bought for herself with the first real money she'd ever earned. She cut a thin piece, tasted it, and stood in the quiet smokehouse for a moment with the particular quality of attention that comes from asking a question you've been working toward for weeks and finally getting an answer. It was close. Not perfect. She could identify 3 specific things she wanted to adjust in the next batch, one of them significant enough to require rethinking part of the curing formula, but close in the way that told her the fundamental approach was right, and the refinements were refinements rather than corrections, and she was on the right track. She cut a second piece, wrapped it in cloth, and brought it to Cole's house. He was at breakfast. Martha let Vivian in with the specific neutral expression of a woman who had watched enough of Cole Ashford's business dealings to have strong opinions about most of them, and the professional wisdom to keep those opinions to herself. Cole looked up when Vivian came in. She set the wrapped cloth on the table, folded back the edge, and said, "First production batch. It needs 3 adjustments before I'm satisfied with it, and I can tell you what those are. But I want you to taste it first without knowing what I think is wrong." Cole looked at the meat, then at her. He picked up his fork, cut a small piece, and ate it. He was quiet for a moment. "What are the 3 adjustments?" he said. She told him. He listened carefully, and she noticed, as she had noticed in their previous conversations, that he listened the way someone does when they're actually processing information rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He asked 2 questions, both of them about the time implications of the adjustments, rather than whether her assessment was correct, which told her something useful. "How long until the next batch is ready?" he said. 10 days if I start today." He nodded. "Start today." She was nearly at the door when he said, "Vivian." She turned. He looked like he was going to say something, and then he looked like he'd decided against it, and then he said it anyway. "Silas came to me this morning." She waited. "He told me the crew is losing confidence in the smokehouse project," Cole said. His words. "The crew," she said. "Or Silas?" Cole didn't answer that directly. He looked at the cloth with the meat in it, which he hadn't touched again. "I told him the first batch results would speak for themselves," he said. "I want you to know I said that." "All right," she said. "That's all," he said. She walked back across the yard in the gray morning light and understood exactly what had just happened. Cole had told her something, and what he'd told her was true. He had said that to Silas, she believed him. But he'd also told her that Silas had come to him, which meant the pressure was active and ongoing, and he wanted her to know it without explicitly asking her to do anything about it. She couldn't decide whether that was honesty or a warning delivered at a careful angle, possibly both. She went back to the smokehouse and started the second batch. Victor Blackwell's presence in the situation became clear over the following 2 weeks, arriving not as a direct action, but as weather arrives, through small signs and changes in atmosphere that added up to something unmistakable before the thing itself became visible. Estes mentioned on one of his supply runs that Blackwell had been making visits around the territory, talking to ranchers. She caught the rest of it in fragments, a comment from Tommy, who had a 19-year-old's gift for absorbing information from conversations he wasn't supposed to be part of. A shift in the way Cole carried himself at dinner, which Martha had started including Vivian in, a decision whose implications Vivian had not fully worked out but did not intend to challenge. What Blackwell was saying, assembled from these fragments, was this. Cole Ashford had made a serious error in judgment. He had given operational authority over a major expansion of his ranch to an unknown woman with no verifiable reputation in Montana, overlooking the experienced men who had built his operation and the result was going to be an expensive failure that would cost the ranch both money and standing. Vivian heard this through enough channels that she was confident it was accurate. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about most things. Not in the moment of receiving the information, but later, when she was alone and could be honest with herself about what it meant. Blackwell wasn't wrong that her reputation in Montana was limited. She'd worked in Wyoming, in Tennessee, in 2 operations in Colorado. None of those places had obvious connections to the Montana ranching community. He wasn't wrong that her authority here was unusual for someone in her position. What he was wrong about, or what she intended to make him wrong about, was the conclusion. But intent and outcome were different things, and she knew it. She pushed the second batch harder, not recklessly. She didn't cut corners on the process, didn't rush anything that couldn't be rushed, but she pushed on the adjustments she'd identified, working through 3 iterations of the formula changes in 10 days instead of the 2 weeks she'd told Cole. She ran the test batches smaller, pulled them earlier, refined the variables faster than she'd originally planned. She was sleeping 6 hours a night, sometimes less. Tommy noticed and mentioned it. "You're going to wear yourself out," he said, with the specific concern of someone who had watched her work long enough to have earned the right to an opinion. "I'm fine," she said. "You said that yesterday and then you knocked over a full jar because your hand slipped." "That was 1 jar," she said, "and I caught it." "Half of it," he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the careful steadiness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was committed to the decision even if it was uncomfortable. "I'm fine, Tommy," she said more quietly. "But thank you." He went back to work, and she went back to work. And she tried to remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal before it got cold, and couldn't. The second batch came out better, significantly better. The 3 adjustments had done what she'd expected, and a 4th refinement she'd added on intuition during the second run had addressed a texture issue in the earlier batch that she hadn't even fully articulated as a problem yet, just felt as a slight wrongness when she'd tasted it. She documented everything, logged every variable, and allowed herself to note in her journal that the fundamental formula was, at this point, essentially what she'd been working toward. She cut samples from 3 different positions on the rack and brought them to Cole without announcement. He was in the yard talking to Garrett when she walked over. Garrett's expression when she approached was the careful, uninvested expression of a man who had been trying to decide about something for long enough that the trying had become its own habit. She handed the samples to Cole and said, "Position matters. The top rack develops differently from the middle. I want you to try all 3. Cole tried all 3, right there in the yard, with Garrett standing 2 feet away. Garrett watched. Cole said, "What's the difference between the top and the middle?" She explained it. She explained it technically and specifically because Cole had consistently responded better to technical specificity than to general claims. And because Garrett was listening, and she knew that Garrett's listening was, at this point, possibly more important than Cole's. When she finished, Cole said, "Which one do you prefer?" "Middle rack," she said, "but it's close. By the 3rd batch, it won't be." Cole nodded slowly. "All right," he said. She walked back to the smokehouse. Behind her, she heard Cole say something to Garrett, too low to catch. She didn't turn around. That evening, Garrett came to the smokehouse alone for the second time. This time, he came all the way in. He stood looking at the rack system for a while, at the organized work table, at the temperature logs she kept pinned to the wall beside the chimney. He didn't pick anything up or touch anything. He just looked. "What's the capacity going to be?" he said eventually. "Full production, when you're where you want to be." She told him the numbers, how many cuts per batch cycle, how many batches she expected to run per month, what the projected output would be at full operation. He was quiet. She could see him doing the arithmetic. "That's a significant operation," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's the point." He looked at her directly for the first time in a conversation that wasn't antagonistic. His face had the slightly uncomfortable quality of a man who is updating a position he'd held for long enough that the updating is physically awkward. "You need anything from the supply barn?" he said. "Hickory's running low," she said. "I've been supplementing with juniper, which works, but hickory gives me more control." He nodded and left. The hickory arrived the next morning, stacked neatly outside the smokehouse door. More of it than she'd asked for. She stood looking at it for a moment, then went inside and logged it in her inventory. The 3rd production batch was the best yet. She knew it before she pulled it. The visual development through the smoke glass she'd installed in the door was exactly what she needed it to be, and the temperature logs showed consistency through the full 48-hour cycle that she hadn't quite achieved in the first two runs. When she pulled the first cut and sliced it, the texture was right, the color was right, and the flavor was exactly what she'd spent 6 weeks building toward. She stood alone in the smokehouse at 6 in the morning and allowed herself 30 seconds of uncomplicated satisfaction before she started logging the data. Then Silas came in. He didn't announce himself, which was characteristic. He walked in while she was writing and stood for a moment looking at the meat on the table. And then he said, "Smells different." "It should," she said without looking up. "It's done correctly." A long pause. "Cole's having the neighboring ranchers out next week," Silas said. "Peterson, the Dahl brothers, a few others. Blackwell's been talking, and Cole wants to address it directly." Vivian looked up from her log. "He's going to show them the smokehouse," Silas said. "Ask you to present." She held his eyes for a moment. His expression was, for the first time she'd observed it, not organized around contempt or challenge. It was something more complicated, something that might have been, in another man, at another moment, a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. "All right," she said. He turned to go, then he stopped. "The hickory was the right call," he said, to the door rather than to her. "Juniper burns too hot at altitude." He left. Vivian looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she wrote the temperature reading in her log and went back to work. That night she wrote in her journal for longer than usual. Not about the smokehouse, for once. She wrote about the specific quality of the past 6 weeks, the way the work had required not just technical competence, but a kind of sustained endurance that she hadn't been fully prepared for, even though she'd been through versions of it before. She wrote about Tommy, who was learning things he'd never have learned if Silas's original contempt hadn't accidentally thrown him her way. She wrote about Garrett and what it meant that the hickory had appeared without being requested beyond a single offhand comment. She wrote about Cole and his silence in the yard the morning her formulas were destroyed, and what it had cost her to keep working after that, and what she thought it would cost her if he was silent again at a moment that mattered. She didn't have conclusions about most of it. That was fine. She wasn't writing toward conclusions. She was writing to keep track of what had actually happened versus what she was afraid might be happening, because those two things could drift apart if she wasn't careful, and drifting was dangerous. What had actually happened was, she had rebuilt a failing smokehouse in 6 weeks. She had developed a production formula that was demonstrably working. She had done it against active obstruction, with inadequate sleep, in a territory where nobody had been prepared to give her the benefit of any doubt. What she was afraid of was simpler. She was afraid that Victor Blackwell's campaign in the territory would outrun the evidence she was building, and that Cole Ashford's commitment to the experiment would soften before the evidence became undeniable enough to matter. She put the journal down and looked at the ceiling of her small room. Then she got up, went back to the smokehouse, and spent 2 hours reviewing her production records by lamplight, making sure every number was correct and every log was complete, and every piece of evidence she would need to present to a room full of skeptical men. The following week was organized and precise and impossible to misread. She fell asleep at the work table around 2 in the morning, her head on her journal, a temperature log still in her hand. Tommy found her there at 5 and didn't wake her. He added wood to the fire instead, checked the temperature, found it within range, and wrote the reading in the log himself, in careful, unpracticed handwriting that she would discover when she woke up 40 minutes later and find, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone had kept watch while she slept. She sat looking at his handwriting in the log for a long moment. Then she started the morning fire. The day before the neighboring ranchers were due to arrive, Vivian spent 12 hours going through the smokehouse from end to end. Not because it needed cleaning, she kept it in consistent order, but because she needed to know, with the specific certainty that only comes from having touched every part of something yourself, that everything was exactly as it should be. She checked the chimney draw, the vent positions, the rack alignment, the temperature distribution at 6 different points in the chamber. She pulled a sample from the current batch and tasted it against the previous batch's sample, which she'd kept for comparison, and confirmed what she already knew. The formula was where she needed it to be. She organized the production record, the formula logs, the temperature charts going back to the first test fire, and arranged them in the order she intended to present them. She thought through every question a skeptical rancher might ask and made sure she had data that answered it directly. What she couldn't prepare for was Cole. He came to the smokehouse that evening, later than usual, when the yard was mostly quiet. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming all the way in. An unusual hesitation for him, she thought, and she watched him. "You ready for tomorrow?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked around the building, the organized racks, the clean walls, the temperature logs on the wall. He had the look of a man who wanted to say something and hadn't figured out the right way into it yet. "I should have said something," he said. "The morning Silas dumped your work." Vivian set down the pen she was holding. She didn't say anything. "I knew it while it was happening," he said, "and I still didn't say anything. I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him directly. There was something in his face that was not the controlled assessment she'd seen on her first day. Something older and less managed. The expression of a man who was being honest about something that cost him something to be honest about. "All right," she said. "That's it?" he said. "What do you want me to say?" she said. "It happened. I rebuilt the work. We're past it." "You rebuilt it overnight," he said. "I know," she said. "I was there." Something moved through his expression, something she might have called, if she were being unguarded about it, respect, though it was the complicated kind that comes with regret built into it. "Victor's going to be there tomorrow," he said. He invited himself, which is his way of doing things. He's going to be looking for reasons to undermine what you've built here. "I know," she said. "You don't seem worried." She looked at the production records arranged on the work table, at the temperature logs on the wall, at the smokehouse she had rebuilt from a failing structure into something that could carry an operation. "Let him look," she said. "The product will say more than either of us." Cole stood quietly for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked back out into the cold night. Vivian stood alone in the smokehouse with the fire ticking quietly behind the vent and the smell of hickory smoke deep in everything around her, and she thought about what tomorrow was. Not a test of the smokehouse, because the smokehouse was working. A test of something more complicated than that. A test of whether the evidence she'd built over 6 weeks was enough to outweigh the stories a powerful man had been telling about her across a territory that had never seen her work. She had done everything she could do. The rest was going to happen whether she was ready for it or not. She banked the fire, checked the temperature one final time, wrote the reading in the log, and walked back across the dark yard to her room. She slept this time before midnight, and if she dreamed, she didn't remember it when she woke. The ranchers arrived mid-morning, which gave Vivian 2 hours after sunrise to check the smokehouse one final time and decide she was as ready as she was going to be. There were 6 of them altogether: Peterson, who ran the largest independent cattle operation north of the valley; the Dahl brothers, Henrik and Carl, who had worked adjacent land to Ashford Ranch for 30 years and had opinions about everything that happened within 20 miles; a younger rancher named Sutter, who had inherited his father's spread 2 years ago and was still figuring out what that meant; and 2 men whose names Vivian didn't catch immediately, older, quiet, the kind who came to listen and form conclusions privately before they said anything at all. Victor Blackwell arrived last. He came in a better wagon than the others, which might have been coincidence and wasn't. He wore the same careful coat she'd seen him in before and moved through the yard with the ease of a man who had been the most important person in most rooms he'd entered for long enough that he no longer thought about it. He saw Vivian near the smokehouse door and nodded at her pleasantly. "Miss Hale," he said. "Looking forward to seeing what you've put together." "Mr. Blackwell," she said. Cole brought the group through the yard with the understated confidence of a man showing something he believed in, which Vivian noted because it was different from the careful, hedged quality she'd seen in him during the weeks when the smokehouse was still uncertain. He introduced her without apology or qualification. "This is Vivian Hale, who runs the smokehouse operation," and left it at that. Peterson shook her hand. Henrik Dahl studied her with the open assessment of a man who considered social tact optional. Carl Dahl looked at the smokehouse. Sutter nodded politely. The 2 quiet men nodded. Blackwell smiled. She took them inside. She had thought about how to do this, whether to lead with the technical explanation or with the product, whether to be formal or to let the building speak first. She decided on the building first, then the process, then the numbers, then the product. Not because it was the most dramatic sequence, but because it was the sequence that made the most logical sense. And she had found, over years of presenting her work to people who started skeptical, that logical sense was underrated as a persuasive tool. She walked them through the rebuilt chimney, explained the draw system and why the original placement had failed, kept it specific enough to be credible and simple enough to follow without prior technical knowledge. Henrik Dahl asked how she'd identified the problem, and she told him. The heat distribution mapping, the test fires, the comparison against 3 other smokehouse designs she'd studied. He listened with the particular attention of someone who understands physical systems and is checking her reasoning against his own. That accounts for why the previous batches were inconsistent, he said. Entirely, she said. The building was working against the process. You can have a skilled operator and the right materials and still produce poor results if the fundamental draw is wrong. The men Cole hired before me weren't failing. The building was failing them. Henrik Dahl looked at his brother. Carl Dahl looked at the chimney. Blackwell said pleasantly, "How many smokehouse operations have you run previously, Miss Hale?" "I've managed curing operations in Wyoming and Colorado," she said, "and I spent 2 years studying under the man who built the most consistent beef curing operation in Tennessee before his death. I can give you specifics on any of those if you want them." "Just curious," Blackwell said. She showed them the ventilation system next, then the rack redesign, then the production logs, temperature charts, formula iterations, yield measurements from each batch. The numbers were real, and the organization was meticulous, and she watched Peterson lean forward over the log table in a way that suggested he was a man who respected data. 4 batch cycles in 6 weeks, he said. 3 complete production batches, she said. The first week was structural rebuild and testing. The first batch was early enough in the process that I wouldn't count it as full production. The adjustments from that batch informed what you're looking at now. And the current batch? In the chamber now. I'll have samples from both yesterday's pull and today's for you to try. She brought out the samples herself, cut on a board at the work table, arranged without ceremony. She didn't narrate while they tasted. She had learned years ago that narrating a product while someone was tasting it was a reliable way to introduce doubt. The moment you told someone what to notice, they started wondering whether they would have noticed it on their own. The room was quiet. Peterson tried both samples twice, which was a good sign. Carl Dahl took a third piece without being invited, which was a better one. Even the 2 quiet men in the back tried both and stood for a moment with the particular stillness of people who hadn't expected what they'd just tasted. Sutter said, "This is better than anything I've had out of any ranch operation I know of." "It's a strong batch," Vivian said. "The next one will be more consistent." "More consistent than this?" Sutter said. "Consistency is different from quality," she said. "I can produce this quality reliably now. What I'm still working on is the yield variation between rack positions. By the next production run, that variation will be within the range I want." Blackwell had taken a single sample piece and held it for a long moment before tasting it. His expression when he did was, for just a fraction of a second, not the pleasant and faintly skeptical expression he'd been wearing since he arrived. It was something more honest, the involuntary face people make when something is better than they were prepared for. Then it was gone, replaced with the pleasant expression, and he said, "Very nice work, Miss Hale," in a tone that was so carefully shaped to suggest it wasn't quite as impressive as she seemed to think that it actually communicated the opposite. Peterson looked at Cole. "What are you thinking for distribution? Local markets first, or are you looking further?" Cole said, "We'll start with the territory and go from there. Vivian has thoughts on the expansion timeline." She laid out the expansion plan, the 3-phase approach she'd developed over the past 4 weeks, scaling production capacity while maintaining quality control, the points at which the operation would need additional labor, and what that labor would need to know. She had the numbers for Phase 1 and good estimates for Phase 2, and she was honest about where the estimates became projections rather than calculations. It was the honesty that seemed to matter most to Peterson. "Most people with something to sell talk in straight lines," he said when she'd finished. "Up and to the right, every quarter. You're telling me there are points where you don't know." "There are points where I have good data and points where I have educated estimates," she said. "I'm not going to blur the line between them." Peterson nodded. He looked at Cole. He looked back at the smokehouse, at the production logs, at the samples on the board. He said, "I'd like to talk about supply agreements." The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Blackwell left before it ended, a departure Vivian noted and filed without visible reaction. He said his goodbyes to Cole with the smooth warmth of a man who had long practice at exits that didn't look like retreats. And then he was gone, and the room was measurably easier after he left, which told her something about how hard everyone had been working to not let his presence set the tone. By the time the ranchers left in the early afternoon, Peterson had indicated serious interest in a supply arrangement, and the Dahl brothers had said, with the specific brevity of men who don't overcommunicate, that they would be back. Cole walked the last wagon out and stood for a moment at the edge of the yard, and then he came back. Vivian was cleaning the sample board. Tommy was restacking the production logs she'd spread across the work table for the presentation. Neither of them said anything when Cole came in. He looked around the building, the logs, the samples, the evidence of the morning's work, and he said, "Well." "Well," Vivian said. Something almost like a smile crossed his face, brief and slightly crooked, the expression of a man who is not practiced at visible relief. "Peterson's serious," he said. "I know," she said. "The Dahl brothers coming back means they're serious," he said. "They don't come back for things they're not serious about." "I know," she said again. He looked at her. "You're not going to say anything about how it went?" "I thought it went well," she said. "The product did what it needed to do." "Blackwell tasted it," Cole said. "You see his face?" "For about half a second," she said. Cole made a short, quiet sound that might have been a laugh. "Half a second was enough," he said. Then he sobered. "He's not done. Whatever today cost him in standing with those men, he's going to find another way to push." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried." "I didn't say that," she said. "I'm worried about the things I can't control. I'm not worried about the things I can." She set the sample board on the shelf. "What I can control is in that chamber right now, running exactly the way I need it to run. That's what I'm going to focus on." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right," and left. Tommy looked at her across the work table. "You were good today," he said. "The product was good," she said. "Don't mix those things up." He looked like he wanted to argue about the distinction, and then he looked like he'd decided it wasn't worth it, and he went back to restacking the logs. She let herself feel it for about 10 minutes, the quiet satisfaction of a morning that had gone the way it needed to go, of work meeting the moment it was built for. Then she pushed it to the back of her mind and went to check the chamber temperature, because the batch currently running didn't care what had happened in the morning, and neither did the next one, and there was still a lot of work between here and where she needed to be. The blizzard came 11 days later, not like an ordinary winter storm. Montana had given her a dozen of those in the weeks since she'd arrived, quick, hard cold that moved through in a day and left the valley quieter and whiter behind it. This was different. She knew it the night before from the specific quality of the cold that came down off the mountains after sunset, a pressure in it that didn't feel like ordinary temperature, but like something the mountain was doing deliberately, pushing its weight into the valley floor. The animals knew it too. She could hear the cattle in the far pasture unsettled in a way they weren't during normal cold. And even the horses in the barn had a restlessness that Estes, when she passed him near the water troughs, acknowledged with a look that said more than he was inclined to put into words. "How bad?" she said. "Bad," he said. "Before morning." She went back to the smokehouse. The current batch was at 31 hours of a planned 48-hour cycle. This was the worst possible moment for a temperature disruption. The meat was deep enough into the process that any significant interruption would not just pause the curing but potentially reverse it, creating conditions inside the chamber that were actively harmful to the product rather than simply neutral. She had enough temperature logs from the previous weeks to know exactly how sensitive this stage of the process was, and she knew what a sustained drop in external temperature would do to the internal dynamics if she didn't compensate continuously. She started building the fire higher and checking the vents. By 10 o'clock that night, the first of the blizzard's leading edge was coming down the mountain. Not snow yet, but wind. Hard, directional, the kind that found every gap in a building's construction and made itself known through each one. The smokehouse, for all the work she'd done on it, had not been built to be airtight, and the wind found the places where the new stonework met the old and worked at them. She spent an hour packing those gaps with rags and old canvas she found in the storage corner, working by feel as much as by sight because the wind kept pushing the lamp flame. The temperature inside dropped 2 degrees during that hour despite the fire, which told her exactly what the night was going to require. She was not going home. She sent Tommy when he appeared at the door at 11. She could see he'd been watching the smokehouse light from the bunkhouse and had come over without being asked, which at another moment she would have found touching, and at this one found both touching and inconvenient. "Go," she said. "There's nothing you can do in here that I can't do, and I need you rested in case this goes past morning." He looked at the fire, at the racks in the chamber, at her. "You're going to stay all night," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Alone." "Tommy, go." He went. She watched him cross the yard through the beginning of the snow, shoulders hunched against the wind, and then he was gone into the dark, and she was alone with the fire and the sound the storm was making as it came down the mountain in earnest. It was a particular kind of alone that she had experience with. Not the lonely kind, but the focused kind. The alone that comes from being the only person responsible for something that can't be left alone. She had felt it before in smaller operations, in circumstances that mattered less, and where the stakes of failure were recoverable. Here the stakes were not recoverable, not in any reasonable time frame. If this batch failed, it wasn't just the loss of the product, but the loss of the momentum she'd built with Peterson, with the Dahl brothers, with Cole's own conviction that he'd made the right decision. She fed the fire and watched the temperature gauge and listened to the wind. The storm hit its full weight around 2 in the morning. She knew it from the sound, a sudden shift in the pitch and pressure of the wind against the building, like a key change in something that had been building for hours. The temperature gauge dropped a full 3 degrees in under 20 minutes, which was the fastest single drop she'd logged in the entire time she'd been running the smokehouse, and she felt it physically, the cold coming through the packed rag gaps despite her work, finding new ways in as the temperature differential between inside and outside widened. She built the fire as high as she dared. Too high was its own problem. Too much heat introduced too fast could cause the same kind of disruption as too little, the chamber temperature spiking and creating inconsistency in the meat's surface layer, even if the internal temperature stayed within range. She had to manage the climb carefully, feeding the fire in measured increments and monitoring the gauge continuously, which meant she couldn't sit, couldn't look away for more than a few minutes, couldn't do anything except stand in front of the fire in a building that was getting colder despite the fire and manage the degrees one at a time. Her hands hurt from the cold. She hadn't worn gloves because she needed the sensitivity for the vent adjustments, the small, precise movements that gloves made harder to control. She was aware of this as a problem and not able to solve it, which was a particular kind of awareness she had developed over years of operating in difficult conditions. The calm cataloging of things that were wrong and couldn't currently be fixed. At some point after 3 o'clock, she wasn't sure exactly, her sense of time had compressed into the space between temperature readings. The door opened. She didn't turn around immediately. She thought it was Tommy, back despite what she'd said, and she was gathering the words to send him back to the bunkhouse when she turned and found Cole standing in the doorway. He was in a heavy coat and work gloves, and he had the look of a man who had been awake for a while and had made a decision about something. He took in the situation, the fire, the temperature gauge, her position in front of the vent controls, with a single sweep of his eyes. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "The south vent," she said. "I've been managing it by myself, but in this wind it takes 2 people to hold it steady when I need to adjust the draw." He crossed the building, took up the position she indicated without being shown twice, and held the vent handle. "Like this?" he said. "Hold it there until I say." She adjusted the primary vent, watched the gauge, felt the draw change, and said, "Half a turn clockwise." He turned it. "Stop." He stopped. She checked the gauge. The temperature was holding, not climbing the way she needed yet, but holding, and holding was enough for the moment. She built the fire up 2 more increments and held the position for 15 minutes, watching the gauge the way you watch something you're afraid to look away from. Cole stood at the south vent and didn't speak. This was something she had not expected from him. The capacity to be useful in a practical, physical way, without making the usefulness into something it wasn't, without the particular self-consciousness that men sometimes brought to situations where they were operating in someone else's domain. He simply held the vent where she put it and waited for her instructions. And when she gave them, he followed them without commentary. The temperature started climbing at 20 minutes past the hour. Slowly, a degree at a time, fighting the cold that was coming through the walls and the floor and the gaps she hadn't been able to fully seal. She tracked every degree in her log without taking her eyes off the gauge for more than the 30 seconds it took to write the number. "You've been tracking this all night," Cole said. Not a question. "Since 10, she said. He was quiet. Outside, the blizzard was at something close to its peak. The wind sound had gone beyond what she'd heard earlier, had reached a register that felt less like weather and more like a sustained physical pressure on the building itself. The lamp swung on its hook. Shadows moved across the walls in ways that had nothing to do with anything inside the smokehouse. "The first time I lost a herd to a blizzard," Cole said, "I was 26. 14 years of saving and borrowing to build that herd. Lost 40% of it in one night." Vivian watched the gauge. "What did you do?" she said. "Sat in the snow for a while," he said. "Then I got up and counted what was left." She looked at him sideways. His face in the lamplight was the honest face she'd seen on the evening before the ranchers came. The face without the controlled assessment, the one that looked like he'd lived the years he'd lived and wasn't trying to organize it into something more presentable. "What's the number you need?" he said, looking at the gauge. 44, she said. "That's the bottom of the safe range for this stage of the process. I've been holding at 42. I need 2 more degrees and I need to hold them for the next 6 hours." "How long until you think we get there?" She looked at the gauge, at the fire, at the current rate of climb. "An hour," she said, "if the wind doesn't get worse." The wind got worse. Not dramatically. Not a single catastrophic gust, but a sustained increase in pressure that she felt in the building before she saw it in the temperature readings. The walls taking more of the storm's weight, the gaps reopening along the original seam where the new stonework met the old. The temperature stopped climbing and started dropping again, a degree over 10 minutes, and she felt it in her chest before she saw it on the gauge. She looked at the fire. She was already running it at the highest level she considered safe. Going higher meant trading one problem for another. The product's surface temperature couldn't tolerate a sudden spike, even if the internal temperature needed the help. "Cole," she said, "tell me. I need you to seal those gaps again." She pointed to the wall sections she'd packed with rags earlier in the evening, where the wind had reopened the seams. "There's more canvas in the corner. You'll need to hold it against the wall and I'll give you something to fix it with." He was across the building before she finished the sentence. They worked it together, not elegantly. Nothing about the next 40 minutes was elegant. It was cold and awkward and required 3 tries on the worst section of wall before they found a configuration that held. Cole's gloves made the fine work harder, but she didn't tell him to take them off because the temperature in the building had dropped enough that bare hands on stone for any length of time would be a genuine problem, and she needed him functional for hours yet. When the worst gap was sealed, he said, "How's the gauge?" "Give it 5 minutes," she said. They stood beside the fire and waited. The temperature gauge stopped dropping at 41 degrees. Then, over the following 15 minutes, it climbed back. 42, 43. At 44, she let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than she'd realized. "There," she said. Cole said nothing. He was watching the gauge too, and his face had the focused quality of a man who had understood, somewhere in the last hour, exactly what was at stake and had adjusted himself accordingly. She maintained the position for another 30 minutes, building the fire in careful increments, monitoring the gauge, checking the sealed gaps, adjusting the south vent by degrees so small that the movements were barely visible. Cole held the vent where she put it and didn't ask questions, and the silence between them was the specific kind that develops between 2 people who are working toward the same thing and don't need to narrate it. Around 4:30, the wind shifted. Not completely. The blizzard wasn't done. But the character of it changed, going from the sustained high-pressure assault it had been maintaining to something more intermittent, gusting and releasing rather than pushing constantly. This was actually more manageable from a temperature control standpoint because it gave the building's interior a chance to stabilize between gusts rather than fighting a continuous pressure differential. "It's starting to break?" Cole said. "Starting," she said. "The worst is past." He looked at her. She looked like what she was, A woman who had been awake for 19 hours, managing a fire in a cold building through a mountain blizzard, with wood smoke in her hair, and a temperature log in her hand, and the steady, slightly hollow quality of someone running on will past the point where energy had given out. He looked like what he was, too. A man who had come out in the middle of a blizzard because he'd seen a light burning and understood something about what it meant. "Sit down," he said. "I'll watch the gauge for 20 minutes. I need to—" "I'll call you if it moves," he said. 20 minutes. She sat down on the stool in the corner, which she hadn't sat on in 5 hours. The cold was deep in her joints in a way she hadn't been fully aware of while she was moving. She put her hands near the fire and felt the sting of warmth returning to them. Cole stood at the gauge. He checked it at the intervals she'd established. Every 3 minutes, logged, same as she'd been doing since 10 o'clock. She watched him do it and saw that he understood the system she'd built, not because she'd explained it to him, but because he'd watched her operate it for the past 2 hours. He had the learning quality of someone who pays the specific kind of attention that most people only manage for things they care deeply about. She didn't mean to fall asleep. She knew she had when she woke up because the lamp was lower and the light had changed. Not full daylight yet, but the beginning of the gray that preceded it, the particular color of a Montana sky in the last hour before the sun cleared the eastern mountains. The blizzard sound had changed too, softer now, the storm exhaling instead of pressing. Cole was still at the gauge. "What time?" she said. "Nearly 6, he said. She was on her feet and at the gauge in 2 seconds, looking at the number, 46 degrees. She stared at it. 46 was 2 degrees above the minimum safe threshold, and it had been holding. She could see from the log in Cole's hand, which he'd continued through whatever hours she'd slept, that it had held at 44 or above since just before 5 o'clock. She looked at the log. His handwriting, steady and consistent, a reading every 3 minutes for 2 hours. She looked at the rack through the smoke glass. Every piece was still in position. The color development she could see was exactly right. Not disrupted, not uneven, not any of the things she'd been afraid of through the long night. The curing process had continued. The batch had come through. She stood for a moment with the log in her hand and felt something move through her that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite exhaustion and wasn't quite the satisfaction of the previous day's presentation, but was something that had elements of all three mixed with something she didn't have a clean name for. The feeling, perhaps, of having been in a bad situation and having had someone come and stand beside her in it without being asked. She turned around. Cole was watching her. He looked tired, which was fair, but his eyes were clear and his face had the particular quality of someone who has spent the night doing something that mattered and knows it. "It's going to be all right," she said. "The batch is going to be all right." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I've been watching the gauge since midnight," he said. "I could tell." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You should have woken me." "You needed 20 minutes," he said. "You were asleep for 2 hours, which suggests you needed that too." "You kept the log," she said. "You built the system," he said. "I just followed it." She looked down at the log in her hand, at his handwriting in the spaces she'd left between her own entries. The same 3-minute intervals, the same precise notation, the same structure she'd established. He'd followed it exactly. "Thank you," she said. It came out simpler than she'd intended, which was appropriate. Simple was what it was. Cole picked up his coat from where he'd set it hours ago and said, "I'll send Martha over with breakfast." He was at the door when she said, "Cole." He turned. "Why did you come?" she said. It wasn't a challenge. She genuinely wanted to know. Not the obvious answer, the light in the window and the concern for the batch, but whatever had made him walk across the yard in a blizzard at 2 in the morning rather than trust that she had it. He considered the question for a moment, with the same unhurried quality he brought to most things. "You'd been in there alone since 10 o'clock, he said, "and I'd done that once before. Left someone alone with something they shouldn't have had to manage by themselves. I wasn't going to do it twice." He held her gaze for a moment, and she understood exactly what he was referring to, and she let herself understand it without saying anything, because some acknowledgments are better made in quiet. Then he went out into the gray morning, and Vivian stood in the smokehouse with the fire ticking and the temperature holding and every batch of meat on every rack intact, and she breathed the smoke-heavy air and let the events of the night settle into their proper shape. Outside, the blizzard was finishing itself against the mountains. spending the last of its force in slow, soft falls of snow that covered the yard in clean white and made the whole ranch look, for the hour before anyone else was awake, like a place that had never been troubled by anything. It hadn't, of course. Trouble was still there, still coming, still wearing Victor Blackwell's careful coat and pleasant expression somewhere down the valley. But the batch had survived. The smokehouse had held. She had gotten through the night. That was enough, for right now. That was enough. Martha brought breakfast at 7, as Cole had promised. Biscuits, salt pork, coffee, hot enough to mean someone had been watching the pot. She set it on the work table without comment and looked around the smokehouse with the expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to understand what a room looked like after a hard night had been spent in it. "You eat all of that," she said to Vivian. "Not half of it, all of it." "Yes, ma'am," Vivian said. Martha left. Vivian ate every bite standing up because sitting down felt dangerous. She was afraid if she sat she wouldn't get back up, and the batch still had 14 hours left in its cycle and needed monitoring regardless of what the night had cost her. She drank 2 cups of coffee and felt the warmth of them move through her like something being restored from a long distance. Tommy arrived at 7:30, took one look at her face, and started checking the temperature log without being asked. 46, he said. "It's been holding there since 5, she said. He exhaled. She could see the specific quality of relief in it. He'd been awake watching the smokehouse light through his bunkhouse window. She was certain of it, and he'd made himself stay where she'd sent him, and that had cost him something. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll sleep tonight," she said. "Right now I need you to check the south vent seals and tell me if any of them shifted during the last hour of the storm." He checked them. 2 of the rag and canvas patches had loosened slightly at the edges as the stone warmed and expanded with the returning day. Not critically. The temperature was holding. But she had him repack them anyway, because she intended this batch to come out of the chamber without a single variable unaccounted for, and she was not going to start getting casual about details when she was this close to the finish. The blizzard's aftermath settled over the ranch in the particular way that follows a serious storm. A quietness that was different from ordinary winter quiet, something in it that felt like the world taking stock of itself. The snow was deep and clean across the yard, and the hands moved through it at the careful pace of people working around something that had nearly been worse than it was. Word of the night spread the way things spread on a working ranch, which was quietly and completely, through the specific channels of men who work in close quarters and notice more than they say. By mid-morning, everyone on the property knew that Vivian had spent the night managing the smokehouse through the storm. By noon, they knew Cole had gone out to help her at 2 a.m. By evening, when the batch came out of the chamber on schedule and intact, they knew the result. Vivian pulled the first cut at 5:30 and sliced it at the work table with the same attention she'd given every previous test, not rushing the evaluation because she was tired and relieved, not letting the emotional weight of the night color her assessment of what was actually in front of her. She tasted it. Then she stood still for a moment. The blizzard had not hurt it. If anything, and she was careful with this, careful not to read into it what she wanted to find rather than what was there. If anything, the extended temperature management through the night had produced a slightly deeper penetration of the curing mixture at the muscle fiber level than she'd achieved in the previous batch. The difference was subtle, the kind of thing you could only detect if you'd been tasting your own work through enough iterations to know exactly what you were comparing against. But it was there. She wrote it in the log. 3 paragraphs, specific and precise, because this was exactly the kind of data point that would be important to understand when she tried to reproduce it deliberately rather than accidentally. She was still writing when she heard boots on the stone threshold and looked up to find Silas Boone standing in the doorway. He was alone, which was unusual. He came most of the way into the building before he stopped, which was more unusual still. He looked at the pulled batch on the table, at the temperature log on the wall, at the sealed gaps in the stone where the canvas was still fixed from the night before. He stood there for a long moment, looking at all of it. Vivian waited. "Cole told me what happened last night," Silas said. "Not as an opening to something else, just a statement placed in the room." "All right," she said. "He said you managed the temperature alone from 10 until he got there at 2. "Yes." 4 hours in a building losing heat in a mountain blizzard, he said. She didn't answer that because it wasn't really a question. Silas looked at the batch on the table. He was a man who had worked with his hands for enough years that his relationship to physical evidence was direct and uncomplicated. He understood what he was looking at better than he understood, or was willing to understand, many other things. He looked at the meat the way he would have looked at a fence repair or a structural fix on a barn roof, reading the quality of it against the conditions it had been produced under. "Can I try a piece?" he said. She cut one and handed it to him without ceremony. He ate it slowly, the way people do when they're paying attention rather than just eating, and his face went through something during that 30 seconds that she watched with the careful, neutral attention she'd learned to maintain in exactly these moments. He set the fork down. "That's the best smoked beef I've ever had from a ranch operation," he said. He said it the way he'd have said any other plain fact. The temperature reading, the stock count, the fence measurement, no particular emphasis. Just the truth as he assessed it. Vivian looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Then he said, and this was the thing she hadn't expected and didn't know how to prepare for, even if she'd had warning. "I was wrong about you. Not about everything. I still think Cole should have handled the announcement differently, brought the crew in before he brought you in. But I was wrong about you specifically, your ability, what you do when it got hard." He paused. "I want you to know I know that." She recognized those words. Cole had said almost the same ones to her on the evening before the rancher presentation. She wondered if that was coincidence, or if Silas and Cole had talked in a way that neither of them would have described as talking about her, but was. "I appreciate you saying it," she said. He turned to go. At the door he stopped, with the same slight hesitation she'd seen in Cole, at the same position in the same building, and said, "The crew is going to follow your lead on the smokehouse now. Not because I told them to, because last night is the kind of thing men on a working ranch understand. You stayed when it mattered." Then he left. Vivian stood alone for a moment. She sat down on the stool in the corner, the stool she'd been afraid to sit on the previous night, and let the tiredness come all the way up, the full weight of 31 hours without real sleep and 8 hours of crisis management in a freezing building. She let herself feel it completely, which was something she didn't usually allow because feeling it completely made it harder to keep going, and she almost always had to keep going. Right now, for approximately 5 minutes, she didn't have to keep going. She sat in the corner of the rebuilt smokehouse she had brought back from nothing, with the evidence of the night before still visible in the sealed wall gaps and the careful temperature log, and she breathed the hickory smoke air, and she let herself understand that something had shifted. Not finished, not resolved, not tied up in the way things only got tied up in stories rather than life, but shifted in a direction she had been working toward for 2 months. Then she got up, picked up her pen, and went back to the log. Victor Blackwell moved within the week. She heard about it not from Cole but from Estes, which was how she heard about most things that entered the ranch from the outside world, because Estes ran the supply circuit through the territory and had, over 30 years of driving the same routes, developed a comprehensive understanding of what was said along them. "Blackwell's been at the Cattlemen's Association," Estes said, loading crates near the smokehouse with the same careful neutrality he brought to all information delivery. "Talking about quality standards, saying the territory needs to think carefully about who they're entering supply agreements with." Vivian was reviewing production schedules. "Is he naming Ashford Ranch specifically?" "Not by name," Estes said. "Doesn't have to." She thought about this through the day. The Cattlemen's Association was the specific kind of institution that operated on reputation and relationships built over decades, and Blackwell had been building his in it for longer than most of the current members had been attending. What he was doing was not illegal, not even particularly dishonest by the standards of territorial commerce. He was applying social pressure through institutional channels, which was a sophisticated form of the same thing Silas had done with a table full of curing jars. The principle was identical even if the method was unrecognizable as such to the people experiencing it. She brought it to Cole that evening. He already knew. He was sitting at the table in his main room with papers spread in front of him, which she had come to understand was his version of the expression her journal was hers, a place to put things that needed thinking through, organized into visible form. "Peterson heard about it," Cole said. "He came by this afternoon." "What did Peterson say?" "He said he was still interested in the supply agreement." Cole paused. "He also said Blackwell specifically told him that no serious rancher in the territory would stake his reputation on an operation run by a woman with no verifiable Montana credentials." Vivian sat down across from him. And? And Peterson said he'd tasted the product and he trusted his own palate more than Blackwell's opinion. Cole looked at her. But Peterson is one man. There are 8 members of the association with influence over the kind of supply relationships we're trying to build, and Blackwell has personal history with 5 of them. She absorbed this. What do you want to do? She said. Cole looked at her for a moment. I want to invite them here, he said. All 8. Not just the ones who already came, all of them, including the ones Blackwell has influence over. I want them to see the operation, see the records, taste the product, and make their own judgment. That puts them in a position to publicly validate or reject what we're doing, she said. If they come and they're not convinced, Blackwell has a room full of witnesses. Yes, Cole said. I know that. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her with the steady quality she'd come to understand was not stubbornness, but a form of conviction. The particular confidence of a man who had calculated the risk and decided it was the right risk to take. All right, she said. When? 2 weeks, he said. Gives you time to run another complete cycle. I'll need the operation producing at full planned capacity, she said. Not a demonstration batch. Full production, so they're seeing what the ongoing operation looks like, not a showpiece. Can you do that in 2 weeks? She thought about it carefully, not to seem thoughtful, but because it required genuine calculation. The timing of the cycle, the materials on hand, the adjustments she still needed to make to the rack spacing for the higher volume runs she intended at full production. Yes, she said, but I'll need Tommy full-time starting tomorrow, and I'll need Garrett for 3 days of the physical expansion work. Cole nodded. Done. She stood up to leave, and then she stopped because there was something else she'd been turning over for the past several days, and she hadn't found a better moment to say it. Cole, she said. He looked up. Whatever happens with the association, whether they come and it goes the way we need it to, or whether Blackwell has enough influence to turn some of them, I want you to know that this operation is going to be what I've said it's going to be. What happened to the association's opinion doesn't change what the smokehouse is capable of. It only changes how long it takes the territory to recognize it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not to anything she could easily name, but away from the careful management he usually showed in their conversations and towards something more direct. I know that, he said. I knew it after the blizzard. He paused. I think I knew it before that. I just needed the blizzard to stop pretending I was still deciding. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded and went back out into the cold night. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest work she'd done since the initial reconstruction. Full production capacity meant expanding the active rack system to fill the chamber's designed load, which required the physical modification work she'd planned from the beginning but hadn't yet executed because the development batches hadn't needed it. Garrett and 2 other hands spent 3 days under her direction, extending the upper rack tier and adjusting the hanging system to accommodate the increased load without compromising the airflow geometry she'd carefully designed. She and Garrett had settled into a working relationship that neither of them had formally acknowledged, and both of them operated within. He asked questions when he had them, and didn't ask questions when he didn't, which was more than she could say for men she'd worked with who had twice his experience. He had a mechanic's precision with physical work that she found genuinely useful, and he had stopped bringing Silas's opinions into conversations about the smokehouse, which she considered the most meaningful professional development she'd witnessed in the 8 weeks she'd been on the ranch. Tommy had become something she hadn't anticipated when she'd watched him hauling waste stone in her first week. A genuine student with the specific kind of aptitude for technical absorption that only showed up in people who had found the domain their brain was shaped for. He could read the temperature log and understand what it was telling him about the process now. He could adjust the vent draw by feel, not just by instruction. He had started keeping his own notes in a small book she'd given him. Not copies of her notes, but his own observations, his own questions, which were sometimes the questions of a 19-year-old who didn't know enough to know he shouldn't ask them, and therefore asked the exact right thing. She caught herself explaining things to him with more care than she'd originally intended to, going deeper into the reasoning than a task assignment required. She told herself this was efficiency. A better trained assistant was a more useful assistant. And that was true, but it was not the complete truth. The complete truth was that she had started thinking about what it would mean to leave this operation when it was done, when whatever arrangement she had with Cole had run its course, And what happened to the knowledge she'd built here if she was the only one who held it? She didn't examine that thought too closely. Not yet. The full capacity production cycle started on a Sunday and ran for 52 hours. She pushed the timing slightly beyond her standard cycle by 4 hours, compensating for the expanded load with a modified fire management protocol that she'd developed specifically for the higher volume configuration. The temperature held. The draw behaved exactly as the redesigned system predicted. The yield numbers from the first full capacity pull were within 3% of her projections. 3%. She stood at the work table on Tuesday morning with the yield log in her hand and looked at that number for a long time. In the kind of production work she'd spent her career building, 3% variance between projection and result was not a rounding error or a near miss. It was the answer to a question she'd been asking since the beginning: whether what she'd designed in this building was as solid as she believed it was, or whether the early results had been the favorable luck of small batches rather than the validated output of a real system. It was the system. It was working the way she'd designed it to work. She wrote the number in her journal that night, not in the log, which was the record of the operation, but in her journal, which was the record of herself. And she wrote 2 sentences under it that she would not have written in the log because they were not technical observations, but something more personal. She wrote, "This is what I came here to build. It is built." The association members arrived on a Thursday morning, all 8 of them. They came in 2 groups, which Vivian suspected was deliberate. The first group arriving an hour before the second, the 5 men Blackwell had influence over, giving themselves time to see the situation before the remaining 3 arrived. Some calculus of position she could only partially read from the outside. She watched them come into the yard from the smokehouse door and assessed what she could assess at this distance. Blackwell arrived with the second group, which was also deliberate. He positioned himself as an observer rather than a participant, the same role he'd played at the first visit, but the audience was larger now and more significant, and the positioning was correspondingly more careful. He greeted Cole warmly and greeted Vivian with the same pleasant nod he always gave her, and she returned it with the same professional acknowledgement she always returned it with, and both of them understood completely what was happening. She took them into the smokehouse. Full production looked different from development batches. The chamber under full load had a weight and density to it. The smell, the heat, the visual evidence of serious yield. That development work didn't carry. She watched the men take it in, watched them adjust their assessments against whatever they had been prepared to find, and she saw in several faces the specific micro-expression that told her they'd been expecting something smaller. She walked them through the operation systematically. Not the abbreviated version she'd given at the first visit, but the complete technical picture, the rebuild rationale, the formula development process, the temperature management system, the yield projections versus results. She had the full production log on the table, organized in chronological order from the first test fire through the most recent full capacity pull. She had the temperature charts from the blizzard night on the wall with the data points annotated, because the blizzard management was the best single demonstration of what the system could handle under stress, and she was not going to leave it out of the picture. A man named Aldrich, one of the 5 in Blackwell's orbit, looked at the blizzard log for a long time. He was perhaps 60, with the thick-fingered hands of a man who had done serious physical work before he had the money to pay others to do it, and he looked at the temperature readings through the night of the storm with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who understands exactly what maintaining those readings in those conditions required. "Who was managing the fire during this period?" he said, pointing to the stretch between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. "I was," Vivian said. "Alone?" "Yes." He looked at the readings. The readings showed a controlled, methodical response to a temperature crisis. Not a dramatic recovery, not a crisis narrative, just the quiet evidence of someone who had understood the problem and managed it without panic. "Cole came out at 2, Aldrich said. Not a question. He'd clearly heard the story from somewhere. Estes's supply circuit ran both ways. "Yes," she said. Aldrich nodded slowly and moved on to look at the yield comparisons. She brought the samples out at the end of the tour, the same way she'd done it at the first presentation. No narration while they tasted, no direction about what to notice. She gave them the full production batch first and the previous development batch second, in that order, because she wanted them to establish a baseline on the current work before they compared it to anything. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when the thing being tasted is serious enough that talking feels like it would get in the way. Aldrich tried both and then turned to the man next to him, a rancher named Whitfield, whom she'd read as the most skeptical of the group from the moment he walked in, and said something low. Whitfield tried the second sample again and said something back, also low. She watched Blackwell. He was tasting the current production batch with the same controlled expression he'd had at the first visit. But something was different this time. The setting was different, the audience was different, and the product had another month of development behind it from the first time he'd tasted it. She watched him hold the second bite for a fraction of a second longer than the first, and she saw his eyes move very briefly to Aldrich and Whitfield, and she saw what he saw in their faces, and she watched him understand that what he'd been building in the association for the past 2 weeks had just gotten significantly more complicated. Peterson, who had come with the second group and had spent the tour near the back listening more than talking, said, "Miss Hale, would you walk me through the expansion timeline again?" The Phase 2 numbers. She walked him through it. While she talked, she was aware that Aldrich had moved to stand beside Peterson and was listening, and that Whitfield had moved to look at the yield log again, and that the specific spatial arrangement of the 8 association members in the smokehouse was shifting around her in a way that told her something about where the weight of opinion was moving. Blackwell said pleasantly, "What's your plan for consistent quality control as the operation scales? Larger operations have a way of losing the precision that makes small batches distinctive." It was a fair question, technically. She knew he knew it was a fair question. He was too smart not to, and too careful to ask anything that could be easily dismissed. "The system I've built here is designed specifically to scale without losing temperature precision," she said. "The chimney and ventilation geometry is calculated for a chamber 3 times this current load. The formula is standardized to a degree of specificity that makes it reproducible by a trained operator, not dependent on judgment calls at the batch level." She paused. "Would you like to see the standardization documentation? It's in the production log." She said it without edge, without challenge, just an offer. Blackwell smiled his pleasant smile. "Maybe another time," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and she said, still with perfect pleasantness, "Of course." By the time the group moved back to Cole's house for the afternoon conversation, Vivian had read the room well enough to know that whatever Blackwell had been expecting from the morning, he hadn't gotten it. The 3 men she'd assessed as genuinely undecided before entering the smokehouse, Aldrich, Whitfield, and a quiet older rancher named Farrow, had all spent the tour in the specific posture of people actively updating their positions rather than confirming ones they'd arrived with. That wasn't the same as a decision in her favor, but it was not the same as Blackwell's position either, and the distance between those two things was where her work lived. She stayed in the smokehouse while the men talked in Cole's house. She had monitoring to do. The current batch was at the 18-hour mark. And she was not in the habit of waiting in rooms where decisions about her were being made, because waiting that way did something to her internal state that she had learned, after years of experience with it, was not useful. Tommy came out at one point and stood near the door without saying anything. "What?" she said without looking up from the log. "Silas just went into Cole's house," he said. She looked up at that. Silas had not been part of the morning's presentation. His position in the ranch's organizational structure kept him adjacent to this kind of business meeting rather than inside it, and she had not expected him to insert himself. She thought about what it meant that he had. "All right," she said. "Aren't you curious?" Tommy said. "Yes," she said. "And I'll find out what happened when Cole tells me. Check the south vent." He checked it. She went back to the log. Cole came to the smokehouse 2 hours later. He came alone, and he came without the careful management expression she'd spent 2 months learning to read. He looked like a man who had just come through something that had required effort and had come out the other side of it with something he hadn't had before. He said, "Aldrich wants a supply agreement. So does Whitfield, which I did not expect." She set down her pen. "Farrow's thinking about it," Cole said. "The other 2 said they'd heard enough. That's 5 of the 8, counting Peterson and the Dahl brothers." He paused. Blackwell tried to raise the quality at scale question again in the house. Aldrich told him he'd read the standardization documentation himself, and it addressed the concern. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Silas spoke," Cole said. "That's why I'm telling you that part separately. He came in and told them, without being asked, without me prompting him. that he had been wrong in his initial assessment of the operation, and that in 30 years on working ranches, he had not seen production work managed with the same level of system and precision. He said it in front of Blackwell. The smokehouse was very quiet. "I didn't ask him to do that," Cole said. "I know," she said. "He did it because he wanted to," Cole said. "I think you should know that it cost him something. Silas doesn't. He's not a man who reverses himself publicly. It's not how he's built." Vivian looked at the wall for a moment. She thought about the morning he'd dumped her formulas in the mud. She thought about the piece of smoked beef she'd cut him in the smokehouse after the blizzard batch came out. She thought about what Silas had said to her. "I was wrong about you specifically." And the plainness of it, the way he'd said it like a man who had found the words after some cost and was delivering them straight because decoration would have made the cost pointless. "What about Blackwell?" she said. Cole's expression shifted to something that was not quite satisfaction and was not quite regret, but had elements of both. "He left before the meeting was finished," he said. "He'll regroup. He always does. But today he was in a room full of men who had just tasted the product and read the logs and heard Silas, and he couldn't change what any of those things were." She nodded. Cole looked around the smokehouse, at the full racks in the chamber, at the organized production logs on the wall, at the rebuilt chimney that drew cleanly and the ventilation system that had managed a blizzard and the work table with her journal open to the current day's entries. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand the full dimensions of. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one. Not like what I said before. That was acknowledgement. This is an apology." She waited. "The morning Silas dumped your work," he said, "I was standing close enough to stop it before the second jar, and I didn't. I told myself I needed to let the crew dynamic play out, that intervening would make things worse, that there were good operational reasons to let Silas show his hand." He paused. "Those were true things. They were not the reason I didn't move. The reason I didn't move was that I wasn't certain enough about my own decision, bringing you in the way I did. And in that moment of uncertainty, I let you pay the cost of my doubt. That was wrong. I'm sorry." She looked at him. She had carried that morning in the back of her mind for 2 months. Not bitterly, not as a grievance she was nursing, but as a fact about the person she was working for that she needed to hold clearly in order to make accurate decisions about what she could rely on. She had given Cole partial trust because partial trust was what the morning in the yard had earned him, and she had been right to calibrate it that way. This was different. This was not acknowledgement or explanation, or the subtle political communication she'd been receiving from him in careful doses through the 2 months since. This was a man who had located his own failure precisely and named it without looking for credit for the naming. She said, "I know you meant it, the apology." She paused. "And I know what it cost you to let it sit 2 months before you said it. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because the sitting matters. It means you weren't just waiting for a moment when saying it was easy." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "It wasn't easy." "Then I accept it," she said. "Completely." He nodded. He looked like something had been set down that he'd been carrying for a while without fully acknowledging the weight of it. He was nearly at the door when he turned and said, "Vivian, what do you want? Not for the smokehouse, for yourself. When you think about what comes next, what is it you actually want?" She looked at him. It was a question she had been asking herself in the back of her journal for weeks, in the entries she wrote after the operational notes, in the pages she didn't plan, but filled anyway because the thinking needed somewhere to go. She had not answered it clearly yet, even to herself. She was closer than she'd been when she arrived, but she was not there. "I want to stay," she said. It came out simpler than anything else she'd said in the 2 months she'd been here. "But I want to stay on terms that make sense, not as a hired operator who can be replaced when the operation is running smoothly, something different from that." Cole held her gaze. "I think we can talk about something different from that," he said. She nodded. He left. She stood in the smokehouse alone in the late afternoon light, with the fire ticking behind the vent and the temperature holding steady at 46 degrees, and the evidence of 2 months of work organized on every wall around her. Outside, the afternoon was going quiet in the specific way of a ranch settling into evening. The last sounds of work finishing, the animals finding their positions for the night, The particular piece of a place that had been running hard all day and was letting the running stop. She picked up her pen. She had a temperature reading to log, and then another in 3 hours, and then another after that, and the batch had 30 hours left in its cycle. And Victor Blackwell would regroup because that was what men like Blackwell did. And there was still a full expansion plan to execute and a territory to convince and more work ahead of her than behind. But the smokehouse was hers. The operation was real. The men who had spent 2 months deciding what she was had made their decisions, and most of those decisions had landed somewhere she could work with. She wrote the temperature reading in the log, 46 degrees, steady, holding, and she kept going. The conversation about terms happened 3 days later, at the table in Cole's main room, with Martha pointedly making noise in the kitchen at a volume that suggested she considered herself a silent participant in whatever was being decided. Vivian had spent those 3 days thinking carefully about what she wanted, and more precisely, how to say it without either underselling what she'd built or overstating her position in a way that would make Cole feel maneuvered. She had written it out twice in her journal and crossed most of both drafts out, because what she wanted to say was actually simple, and she kept making it complicated by dressing it in justification. She sat down across from him and said it plainly. I want co-ownership of the smokehouse division, not a management fee, not a percentage of profits on a quarterly basis. Actual co-ownership, my name on the operation alongside yours, with defined authority over all production and expansion decisions. In exchange, I commit to building this to the level I've outlined in the expansion plan, training the people who will carry it forward, and staying until it's running well enough that it doesn't depend entirely on me being in the room. Cole had his hands flat on the table. He looked at her with the direct, unhurried quality she'd come to understand was how he looked when he was taking something seriously. That's a significant ask, he said. Yes, she said. I built a significant thing. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man stalling or calculating angles, but the silence of someone being honest with himself about what he was being asked, and whether the answer was already decided. The expansion plan, he said. Phase 2 gets us into markets outside the territory. Yes. Phase 3 is training a second generation of operators so the knowledge transfers. Yes, she said, because an operation that lives entirely inside one person's head isn't an operation. It's a dependency. I don't want to build a dependency. I want to build something that outlasts both of us. Cole looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, because she didn't think she surprised him much anymore, but recognition, the specific kind that comes from hearing something said clearly that you had only been thinking in approximate terms. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right, she said. Yes, he said. All right. She had been prepared for negotiation, for a counteroffer, for conditions attached, for the particular kind of pushback that men in Cole's position often used not to refuse a thing, but to establish that the concession was theirs to give. She had not been fully prepared for a clean yes, and she sat with it for a moment, recalibrating. Martha, Cole called toward the kitchen, can you bring coffee? There was a brief pause, and then the sound of the coffee pot, and then Martha appeared with 2 cups, and the expression of a woman who had heard every word through the kitchen wall and was not going to pretend otherwise. About time, Martha said, to no one in particular, and went back to the kitchen. Vivian looked at her coffee cup. She was aware of a feeling she didn't often let herself have, something that lived between relief and satisfaction, and a third thing she didn't have a clean word for, which was the feeling of arriving somewhere you had been working toward, long enough that the working had started to feel like the permanent condition, and the arriving felt almost unreal. She drank her coffee and let it be real. The paperwork took 2 weeks. Cole's lawyer came out from town, a careful man named Greer, who read everything 3 times and asked questions that revealed a thorough understanding of what he was drafting, which Vivian respected. She read everything he produced with equal care, asked her own questions, and requested 2 changes that Greer incorporated without objection. When it was done and signed, she was co-owner of the Ashford Smokehouse division, and she stood in the smokehouse on the evening after the signing with the copy of the agreement in her hand and the hickory fire burning steadily, and felt the specific weight of something that was hers in a way that temporary work had never been and never could be. She put the agreement in the tin box with the Tennessee notes and the key Cole had handed her on her first day, and she put the tin box on the shelf she'd built into the wall of the smokehouse in her third week, and she went back to the production log. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, which was something she had made her peace with long ago. The work didn't stop because the circumstances changed, and she didn't want it to. What changed was what the work was building toward, and what it was building toward now was hers. Phase 2 of the expansion began in January. The physical work came first, extending the smokehouse structure to accommodate the second chamber she'd designed, which nearly doubled the operation's capacity and required 3 weeks of construction, with Garrett managing the crew and Vivian managing Garrett with the direct specific instruction style they'd worked out over the previous months. She had learned that Garrett received technical direction better when she explained the reasoning behind it, not because he needed to be convinced, but because understanding the why made him better at adapting when the physical reality of the construction diverged from the plan, which it always did in some way. He had become, without either of them formally acknowledging it, her construction foreman. He didn't use the title and she didn't offer it, but the function was clear and the crew responded to it without confusion, which was the only measure that mattered. Tommy was in the smokehouse every day now. She had started in the third month giving him formal instruction rather than the incidental teaching that had grown up organically between them. She had a structure for it, a sequence she'd worked out based on what she'd wished someone had taught her at 19, the order of concepts and skills that built on each other, in the way that made later learning make sense, rather than having to retrofit understanding backward into things you'd already learned to do mechanically. He absorbed it with the specific appetite of someone who had found the thing they were shaped for and couldn't quite believe it had been waiting for them. One afternoon in the second month of formal instruction, she walked him through the complete chemical process behind the salt curing, the actual mechanism at the cellular level, as much as she understood it, which was more than most smokehouse operators knew because she had spent years reading everything she could find on the subject and had filled the gaps with her own experimental observation. She watched him follow it, watched the moment when the thing she was explaining stopped being a set of rules to follow and became a system he could reason about, and she felt something she had not expected to feel about teaching. She liked it. Not in a vague, general way, but specifically and concretely. She liked the moment of understanding crossing someone else's face, liked the questions it produced, liked the fact that everything she put into Tommy's head was still in her own head and also now in his, which meant the knowledge existed in two places instead of one, and was that much harder to lose. She wrote about it in her journal that night. The Tennessee notes. I salvaged them from the rain because I didn't want the knowledge to die with the man who built it. Now I understand that differently. The notes weren't the point. The teaching was the point. He just didn't have anyone left to teach. The spring contracts came in through February and March, arriving by letter and by personal visit in roughly equal measure. Peterson's supply agreement was the first, and set the terms that the subsequent ones roughly followed. Aldrich signed in February. Whitfield came out in person in early March, spent 2 hours in the expanded smokehouse, tried the current production batch against a batch from a competitor's operation he'd brought for comparison, and signed before he left. The Dahl brothers signed with the particular brevity they brought to everything, Henrik writing 3 sentences in the contract's margin to clarify a specific delivery schedule, and Carl nodding when Henrik was done, as though he'd written them himself. Farrow came last, in late March, and his visit was the longest and the most deliberate. He was the oldest of the association members, and the one who had said the least during both visits, which Vivian had come to understand was not indifference, but the particular carefulness of a man who had learned, over a long life, that his word meant something, and he was not going to put it behind something he wasn't certain about. He spent most of his visit not with the production logs or the yield numbers, but with Tommy, watching Vivian teach and asking Tommy questions about what he knew and how he'd learned it. After an hour of this, he came and stood near the work table while Vivian was making formula adjustments. How old is the boy? He said. 19, she said. How long has he been working with you? Since the third week I was here, she said. He started because Silas needed someone to haul waste stone. He stayed because he had good questions. Farrow looked at Tommy, who was on the other side of the chamber checking temperature readings with the absorbed attention he brought to everything now. That boy is going to run a smokehouse operation himself one day, Farrow said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, more like an observation he was making for himself, the kind that crystallize when you've been watching something for long enough. Yes, Vivian said. That's the idea. Farrow looked at her. Then he said, "My father built a grist mill in Ohio in 1831, best mill in 3 counties. When he died, nobody knew how to run it. They tried, and they lost it in 2 years." He paused. "I always thought about that. The thing he built, and the knowing that should have gone with it, and how they got separated." Vivian looked at him. "Sign the agreement, Mr. Farrow," she said, without edge, "and I'll send you the first quarter's delivery on time and exactly to specification." He smiled, the first time she'd seen that from him. "All right," he said, and signed. Victor Blackwell's regroup, when it came, was not what she'd expected. She had been watching for another institutional move, something through the association, another round of conversations designed to work at the agreements she'd built before they were fully established. Instead, Blackwell arrived at Ashford Ranch himself, alone, on a Thursday morning in April. He asked to see Cole, and Cole brought him to the smokehouse, which told her something about how Cole had thought about the meeting before it happened. Blackwell looked at the expanded operation, the second chamber under construction, the increased rack capacity, the organized production running at full scale in the original chamber, and he looked at it without the pleasant neutral expression he'd worn during his previous visits. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been arguing against, and can no longer argue against without arguing against the evidence of his own eyes. He said, to Cole rather than to Vivian, "You've built something real here," Cole said. "Vivian built it." Blackwell looked at her. The pleasant expression came back, but it was different now. Not the careful social construction she'd seen before, but something more tired underneath it, the expression of a man who is being gracious, because the alternative is being graceless, and he has enough pride left to know the difference. "Miss Hale," he said, "I underestimated what you were doing here. I want you to know I understand that." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what she wanted to say and whether she wanted to say it, and she decided she did. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "you didn't underestimate what I was doing. You understood it exactly. You just thought you could stop it before it became too established to stop." She paused. "I don't hold that against you. It's a rational thing to try if protecting your position in the territory is what matters to you. But I want to be honest about what it was, because I think you're a man who respects honesty more than diplomacy." Blackwell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right." And there was something in the way he said it, not defeat, not warmth exactly, but the specific acknowledgement of one capable person to another when the maneuvering is done and what's left is the plain fact of what happened, that she could respect, even if she couldn't like him. He left without any further conversation, and she watched him go, and she thought that was probably the last time he'd come to Ashford Ranch on that particular kind of business. Cole stood beside her after Blackwell's wagon disappeared down the road. "That's over," Cole said. "The direct part," she said. "He'll keep working his relationships in the territory. He's not going to become an ally, but he's also not going to spend more energy on something that's already built." Cole nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road where Blackwell had been. Then he said, "Do you think about where you would have gone if this hadn't worked?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "Wyoming, probably. There's an operation I heard about near Laramie that's been trying to solve a consistency problem for 2 years. The kind of problem I know how to solve." She paused. "But I don't think about it much." He looked at her. "Why not?" "Because this worked," she said. "I don't spend a lot of time on the road not taken when the road I'm on is going where I need to go." He made the short, quiet sound that was his version of a laugh. She'd come to recognize it over the months. It happened when something struck him as true in a way he hadn't expected. The second chamber was operational by May. The opening of it was not a ceremony. She didn't do ceremonies. But there was a moment at the start of the first production run that had the quality of one anyway. The full crew was there, most of them, the men who had been on the ranch when she arrived, and the 2 new hands she'd hired specifically for the expanded operation. Tommy stood near the control vent with the posture of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Garrett had his arms crossed and was looking at the second chamber's construction with the expression of a man checking his own work and finding it acceptable. Silas stood near the back. He had changed, over the months, in the specific way that people change when the position they've held has been revised not by force, but by accumulating evidence. He was not a different person. He still managed the ranch operations with the same contained authority he'd always had, still had opinions. He shared plainly and without apology. Still was not a man who wasted words on things he didn't mean. But his relationship to the smokehouse had become something she hadn't predicted, a kind of protective regard. The way a man who once opposed a thing and then changed his mind can sometimes become its fiercest defender because the change cost him something, and the thing better be worth what it cost. He came to the smokehouse regularly now, not to observe but to check on things with the practical concern of someone who has decided the operation is worth checking on. He had, without any formal arrangement, started funneling the best quality beef from each processing run to the smokehouse first, before distribution to other uses, which was a resource allocation that cost him something in his own operational planning and that he had never mentioned or asked credit for. She had noticed. She hadn't mentioned it either. When the first full run of the second chamber started that May morning, she looked across the building at Silas and gave him a nod. He returned it once, and that was the entire acknowledgement between them of everything that had happened since the morning he'd walked into this building and dumped her work in the mud. Some things don't need to be said at length. Sometimes a nod carries all of it. That evening, she sat in the smokehouse long after the crew had gone, with the fires burning in both chambers and the temperature logs on the wall and the agreement in her tin box on the shelf, and she wrote in her journal for longer than usual. She wrote about the Tennessee notes, the starting point of all of it, the knowledge she'd salvaged from a trash pile in the rain because she hadn't been able to stand the idea of it being lost. She wrote about what she understood now that she hadn't understood then, that knowledge is not a thing you can possess. It lives in people. The moment you stop passing it on, it starts dying, regardless of how carefully you've written it down, because written notes are only as useful as the person who knows enough to read them correctly. She wrote about Silas and what it had meant to watch a man who had been certain about something become uncertain and then arrive at a different certainty. Not because he'd been defeated, but because the evidence had been real and he was under the contempt and the territorial pride, a man who could be moved by real evidence. She wrote about Tommy, who was 19 years old and already understood things about curing chemistry that most operators twice his age didn't know, and who would take that knowledge somewhere she couldn't predict and do things with it she couldn't imagine, which was exactly the point and exactly what she'd been working toward. She wrote about Cole and stopped and thought for a while, and then wrote something she crossed out, and then wrote it again more honestly. She wrote that she had spent a long time learning not to need people to protect her, because needing that and not getting it was a specific kind of damage she'd sustained enough times to have learned to prevent. What she hadn't fully learned, and what these months had been teaching her by degrees, was the difference between not needing protection and not needing anyone. Those were different things. She had been treating them as the same, and they weren't. She didn't write much more than that. It was enough for now. Cole came to the smokehouse that evening. Not at a time she'd expected, later than he usually came by, when the sky was fully dark and the valley was quiet, and the smoke from both chambers was rising straight up in the cold, still air. He stood beside her at the door, both of them looking out at the dark valley, and he said, "How does it feel?" She thought about the real answer, which was complicated, and she gave him the version of it that was true without being more than she wanted to say out loud right now. "Like I built the thing I came here to build," she said, "and like that's not the same as being done." "No," he said, "it's not." They stood quietly for a while. The fire ticked behind them in the chambers. The snow on the mountain above the valley caught what little light the sky held and gave it back in the specific blue-white of winter in Montana, the color that looked cold and was. "Vivian," Cole said. She waited. "I'm glad you needed a building with a broken chimney," he said, "and I'm glad I was the one who had it." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the valley with the expression he usually reserved for things he felt strongly about and didn't plan to say again. "That's a strange thing to be glad about," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I am." She thought about the first morning, the wagon pulling into the yard, the abandoned building at the edge of the property, the key he'd handed her with the particular gesture of a man making a decision he wasn't fully certain about. She thought about everything that had happened between that morning and this one, and she tried to find the moment when the destination had become the place she was standing. She couldn't find it. That was the thing about arrivals. You were always already there before you understood you'd arrived. "I'm glad too," she said. They stayed at the door until the cold made staying impractical, and then they went inside and checked the temperatures, and the temperatures were holding, and she logged them both in the book. Outside, the smoke continued to rise from both chambers, climbing in two parallel lines above the snow-covered valley, visible from a long way off in the clear winter air. If you were a traveler on the road below the ranch that night, and you looked up and saw those two lines of smoke rising from the Ashford property, you might have thought it was simply a working ranch running its operation through the night, the way working ranches do. You would have been right. That's exactly what it was. What you couldn't have known from the road is what it had taken to make it that way. The woman who rebuilt a failing structure from its foundation up, who stayed through the sabotage and the blizzard and the long institutional pressure of men who needed her to fail in order to maintain their understanding of the way things were supposed to work. Who taught what she knew because she understood that knowledge locked inside a single person is fragile, and knowledge shared is the only kind that survives. There is something that a life of moving from place to place teaches you if you're paying the right kind of attention, and it is this: the thing you are working toward is not a destination. You don't arrive at it one morning and find it waiting. You build it, and the building is the arrival. And when it's done, you look at what you've made and you understand that the next thing to build has already begun. Vivian Hale had come to Ashford Ranch with a tin box and a traveling bag, and 9 years of knowledge she'd salvaged from other people's endings. She had not come looking for permanence. She hadn't believed in it, the way you stop believing in things that have disappointed you enough times. What she found instead was something she hadn't known to look for. A place where what she knew and what she could build and what she could teach were all wanted at the same time by people who had needed long enough to figure that out, that the figuring had changed something in all of them. She didn't call it home the first time she thought it. She circled the word for a while, careful with it, because she had learned that the words you use for important things shape how you hold them, and she didn't want to hold this wrong. But on a quiet evening in May, with smoke rising from two chambers she'd built, and a 19-year-old reading temperature logs in the corner, with the focused absorption of someone becoming who they were going to be, she wrote it in her journal plainly. Home. One word. No explanation attached, because it didn't need one. The smokehouse burned through the night, the way it would burn through every night from that point forward. Not because one woman was fighting alone to keep it lit, but because the knowledge of how to keep it burning had passed from her hands into enough other hands that the fire was no longer dependent on any single person's determination. That was the legacy. Not the building, not the contracts, not the name on the legal agreement. The fire in other people's hands. That was what she'd come to build. And that was what she'd built. And standing in the warmth of it on a cold Montana night, Vivian Hale finally stopped counting the miles back to the road she'd come in on. She was already home.